So I am delighted to be joined by everybody who is here this evening on the Zoom, but particularly our guests. Rabbi Dr. Akiva Tatz, a prominent South African Orthodox rabbi, inspirational speaker, writer, heavily involved in Orthodox Jewish outreach. He's a physician, a world-renowned expert in Jewish medical ethics. Rabbi Tatz is both the founder and director of the Jerusalem Medical Ethics Forum and a senior lecturer at the JLE. He's published books on a wide variety of subjects, including free will and destiny. Let's try that again. Free will and destiny, letters to a Buddhist Jew, the Thinking Teenager's Guide to Jewish Life, and several learned articles. Also, Dr. Alastair Santhouse, a consultant psychiatrist for the last 17 years working at Guy's Hospital in Maudsley. He's an interest in the psychiatry of cancer, an early career in hospital medicine at the Royal London Hospital. His areas of expertise include, not exclusively, medically unexplained persistent physical symptoms, depression, anxiety disorders, and OCD, the psychiatry of cancer, and chronic fatigue syndrome. And Alastair recently published a book which we reviewed head first, highly recommended. Rebecca Corney is a counseling psychologist, which means she's been trained to work with people of all ages with a wide variety of difficulties, such as anxiety, panic, depression, stress, relationship problems. She's worked for many years in the National Health Service and the private sector. She offers talking therapies for individuals, couples, and families. She is currently a clinical supervisor for Dementia UK and offers monthly supervision to the specialist dementia nurses in this role. She's a founder of the High Linden Psychology, which offers bespoke psychology service to you and your family, it says on the website. And I am delighted to welcome all three of them and all of you this evening. So what I thought we would begin with is an opportunity for each of our panelists to bring a topic to the fore, which the others will then discuss a little bit. And after that, we'll go into some of the other topics that have been on the advertisement for this evening. And first off is Dr. Alastair Santhouse. Alastair wants to introduce the idea of our inner Haman. Alastair, welcome this evening.
You're welcome, and it's really a privilege to be speaking with Becca and Rabbi Tatz. I think Rabbi Lawrence mentioned about the evening, and one topic that would come to mind to us about the Purim story, and one came to me very quickly because I'd had the thought a few months ago. Rabbi Lawrence very kindly mentioned my book, and people were very nice in the reviews, but the occasional one review that was less than fulsome would stick in my mind. It would needle me, it would bother me, and I would keep thinking about it, and it would tap into some anxiety that perhaps it was the only really true and honest review. And I began to think that that's just what Haman did, that the whole world practically is bowing down to him, and Mordecai won't. Now, I think someone with a healthy self-esteem might have said, just ignore him. What does he know anyway? And I can be satisfied with 99.9%, and it doesn't have to be 100, but it needles him and it really bothers him. And I think it taps into a very common psychological process, which you see in all sorts of mental health problems, where people will selectively abstract a small piece of information from a greater whole. So in Haman's case, everyone's bound down to him, but one person isn't. Then they'll overgeneralize it and make it mean something that it doesn't. So they'll give it a prominence that it doesn't deserve, and they'll base a lot of their thinking and decision-making on that. And I think people with all kinds of mental health problems do that. For example, people with depression will just selectively see the negative and make it into the greater whole. And people with anxiety will selectively see the threat in somewhere. And what it can do is distort your thinking, which in turn impacts on your emotion. And it can really affect your subsequent behavior. And I often find when you have a character like Haman, who is very unidimensionally portrayed as evil and completely unrelatable, often you can start to see aspects of their character that you can obviously not relate to in the sense of being like that person, but they have relatable human parts to them. And I think it's sometimes helpful in understanding someone's character to see those. So that was my choice, was the inner Haman, which I think we all to some extent have. And by the way, if Haman had healthier self-esteem, we wouldn't be eating all his Hamantashim in a couple of nights' time.
Right, I don't know if people saw the a packet of Hamantaschen was on sale, which was spelt Haman, Human. So they were human Taschen. Not great. So thanks, Alastair, for introducing this idea of rumination on bad reviews. Rabbi Tatz, do you have anything to comment on Alastair's concerns about the bad reviews he gets and the way that we look at ourselves and the way we're judged?
Yes, I think that it's central teaching in Jewish character building is to learn to see things objectively. Alastair's talking about people who see very subjectively one aspect of their reality, and then they expand that to define and describe the totality. I think you can't begin to make any spiritual progress until you learn some level of objectivity. I mean, I see this in my own personal work. One of the things I deal with often is people who have a view about, let's say, vaccines or some other aspect of the medical world. They take a particular view, and then everything is shaded and colored by that view. And no matter how much objective or anti or contrary views you bring to that, all somehow seems to be subsumed in one particular worldview. And I think that this is due to a number of factors. One is that we're living in a world which is incapable of seeing subtlety. It's a childish characteristic to see things as all black or all white, and not to appreciate that the world is a very rich pastiche, if you like, or panorama of subtlety. And I think that's if the one thing Talmudic training gives you, it's an ability to see the nuances in every position. The second feature, I think, that is relevant to Alastair's point is also that this is aided and abetted by what they call a post-truth world. We're living in a world where you don't even have to pay lip service to the truth. You can say whatever you want and it's perfectly acceptable. And you see that people are electing world leaders who don't even pretend to have an objectivity or speak for the truth. You can say whatever you want and assert it, and just because you asserted it, it becomes a fact. I think all of these are playing into a dangerously subjective perception of reality, and I think that it's appropriate to begin the work of becoming objective. I just add one more comment, if I may. How do you move towards objectivity? There are two tools that we teach. One is brutal and ruthless honesty about the world and about yourself. And perhaps even more important is you need a spiritual teacher. You need someone, we phrase this as a selech harav. You need somebody who's unafraid to tell you the truth about yourself, has a bigger, more objective version of reality, and knows you well. And finally, I would say this. If you're unable to ask your teacher, you can often ask yourself, what would he or she have said? If you know your teacher well, I'll give you a medical example. My father was a wonderful doctor. And he taught me how to think as a doctor. Many medical situations I find myself in life when I'm not sure what to do, I take a moment and I say, what would my dad have said? And it is so clear. I mean, so clear. And then it becomes, a touchstone of objectivity. So they're tools one can use to move in that direction.
Thank you very much. Rebecca, if you were giving either Al or Haman a bespoke medical, a bespoke psychology service, how would you address his rumination on bad reviews?
Well, maybe just drawing on both.
Sorry, just to interrupt there, the one bad review against the hundreds of thousands of really good reviews.
Well, I think I think just drawing on both of those points, actually, I was thinking about a metaphor that a woman she's a psychologist called Susan David. I recently listened to one of her podcasts. She's a psychologist in Harvard, and she talks about the idea of when you're holding on so tight to an emotion, and it might be anger or the concept of revenge, or it might be, you know, a complete lack of, you know, objectivity about the world, it's like carrying a set of books and you're holding on to them so tightly, and they're piled up so high that you just can't see anything else around you. And so I was thinking about actually Rabbi Tatz's question, you know, what would my dad say, you asked. I was thinking about who else is noticing that you're holding these books so tightly, which is a very systemic question. It's a very sort of a family therapy influenced framework. But who else is there that can help you notice a different perspective when you can't see it yourself?
Thank you very much for that, Rebecca. And we remember your dad, and many people in the community will be asking the question occasionally, what would your dad have done in really important issues? He was a fantastic leader and one of the sorry losses of this period. So back to you again, Rebecca. The topic you wanted to raise this evening was courage versus adversity.
Well, not so much versus adversity, but perhaps as a response to adversity. So I was thinking about, you know, the idea that no matter how skillful, how wise, how rich, how educated we are, life is hard sometimes. And, you know, you've just brought up my father, but, you know, we're faced with real griefs and real fears. And so collectively, you know, we can feel very anxious, you know, by the world around us, but also on an individual level, we can feel terrified and afraid, and that can stunt us, that can freeze us. That's our natural response to fear, is, you know, fight or flight, or absolutely stay frozen. So we can avoid facing or confronting the things that really frighten us. Or as you know, I mentioned just before, we can hold on so tightly to those books, become so embedded in one particular emotion that also makes us feel very stuck. So the space in between, I think, is where courage sits. And I think this is, for me, what the theme I draw out of the Megillah, Esther, Mordecai, the Jewish people, how they find that courage by allowing their stress to awaken the courage, allowing their fear, their terror to stimulate their connection and growth. There's actually just reminded me of a woman called Linda Graham. She's also written extensively about resilience. She talks, breathe into the me and breathe out to the we, which I love that, because it's about making connections, taking actions between us that allow us to show our courage. I think that's spoke to me as something to draw on.
Alastair, how do you help somebody find their inner courage?
I mean, it's interesting. I remember Rabbi Tatz once said years ago something that stuck in my mind, which is, you never really want to be tested. I hope I've remembered that right, since I'm right in front of him. But I think he was saying it in reference to King David. And it stuck in my mind because you don't really know until you're tested whether you'll find that courage. And it troubles me that, because I think it goes to the essence of who you are. I think you show courage when your core values are under threat and you need to do what's right, not because it's easy, but because it's right. And I think in a wider sense in life, there was a nurse who once wrote about the regrets of the dying. She was called Bronnie Ware, and she talked about the regrets of dying patients. And one of the commonest regret was people that didn't live life according to their own values, that weren't true to themselves. And you think, why should that be so hard? But I think it is. I think it is hard to, let's say, put on a yarmulke and take you onto far for whatever, if you think that everyone's going to laugh at you or your boss might criticize you or that sort of thing. That's sort of small time courage. And then there's courage standing up to Vladimir Putin, which you may come on to later. But I think that courage is about being true to your values. And since it's come up, there was that great quote from Atticus Finch in To Kill a Mockingbird. He says, "Courage isn't a man with a gun in his hand. It's knowing you're licked before you begin, but you go ahead anyway and see it through no matter what. You rarely win, but sometimes you do. So that's courage.
So courage is sometimes the risk of failure.
The risk of failure, but also, I think if you're courageous, you have a peace of mind for having done it afterwards, knowing that you did the right thing. And I suspect the contrast is true. You feel ashamed for a lack of courage. Cowardice has never been an accusation that you would take lightly.
Right. A moment where I had to overcome inner cowardice was when I stepped into a room where, unfortunately, a congregant was faring not at all well and really wanted to end the treatment she was on. And in the room at the same time was Rabbi Dr. Akiva Tatz. And she said, I want to talk to Jeremy because I know him. And the coward in me wanted to run out and leave the expert to handle it. Somewhere the courage came up to be able to ask to answer the question in Rabbi Tatz's presence, and he was very, very comforting afterwards and said that I had said the right thing. There was only one way this was going to end, but it can be quite frightening to speak up in front of learned colleagues. Rabbi Tatz, finding the courage.
I think most of the important things have been said. I would add one detail, if I may, and that is, again, coming back to the point of subtle living, and that is, it's possible to be courageous and be afraid at the same time. You know, it's possible to, again, we live in a one-dimensional world where people think you have to be all hero or all coward. You know, things are all or nothing. I'd like to add a deep Jewish teaching, which is that we are expected to live in mixed feelings. You know, and you see that throughout the Torah. I mean, people think that when Abraham was about to kill his son Isaac, Abraham killing Yitzchak, you know, so the common feeling is, you know, he must have been, you know, wallowing in self-pity and agony and so forth. But actually, our sages tell us that he had two richly full emotions. One was incredible sadness for the death of his son, and unbelievable joy at fulfilling the mitzvah that he was called on to fulfill. You know, the Sephardim have a very beautiful piyut that they say on Yom Kippur, a beautiful poetic, sort of a poetic prayer. And it says, Ayin b'mar bocha b'lev sameach. He had eyes brimming with tears. In fact, the Medrash says he almost drowned in a river of his own tears. And his heart was rejoicing at the mitzvah he was about to perform. But actually, although that's a cosmic level of greatness, we're expected to do that at all times. We say, Gilu bir odo, the Torah says, rejoice in trembling. How do you do that? Well, you know, if you have to knock on someone's door who could change your life radically, your success is totally in this person's hands, if he chooses to do so. Don't you have mixed emotions as you knock on the door? You feel the trepidation of what is about to happen and the unbelievable joy at the opportunity. We are capable of mixed emotions. And therefore, you can be afraid and courageous at the same time. You know, you can be feeling the pain and the risk and the danger, and you can find the courage at the same time. And therefore, I don't think it's a question of, if you're going to wait until you've overcome all the negativity before you act, you'll never act. And therefore, I think it is, again, a question of complexity and subtlety. All those emotions can be tussling and wrestling with each other, and yet there's still a practical decision about which way to go.
So I think that leads into, Rabbi Tatz, what you wanted to talk about, which was doubt and certainty. This is the festival of Mi Yodea. Who knows if this was the moment? We ask the question, who knows? So doubt and certainty, Rabbi Tatz.
Yes, I'd like to say a few words about that. There's something very deep here, which is taught in the writings of Rav Tzadok Cohen, something quite outstanding and exquisite. You know that Amalek is the same gematria, the same numerical equivalent, that word, as the word for Safek, which means doubt. Which means that on a geopolitical plane, there's a genocidal battle between Amalek and us. They try to wipe us out with total unreasonable, beyond any human understanding, a type of a genocidal hatred. They see their role in the world as destroying Jews. And we, of course, have to wipe them out in a self-defense type of a genocidal war. So the simple political interpretation here is a war to the death between two nations. But Judaism always posits the expressions in the world on transcendental forces. And what's being represented in the higher plane is a battle between doubt and certainty. The Jewish people's role is Atem Edai. God says, you are my witnesses. You testify to the world that I'm real, that there's a God in the world. And Amalek is the force of doubt. Maybe yes, maybe not. Maybe it's evolution. Maybe it's accident. Maybe there was a God. Maybe he's no longer interested. That's the cosmic battle. The function of the Jewish people is to assert clarity in a dark and confused world. And Amalek's role is to maintain that gap open. There's an amazing insight into this in a Gemara that says, where do we find Haman's name in the Torah? I mean, this is beyond amazing. The Talmud says, where do we find Haman's name in the Torah? Obviously, we're looking for the root of his name. The answer that's given is quite amazing. When man and woman eat from the fruit of the forbidden tree, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, God appears in the garden and he says to man and woman, Hamin ha'etz, did you eat from the fruit of the tree? And the word Hamin is Haman. Now, what on earth is Haman doing in the original tree of good and evil? And the answer is this. That tree is not the tree of evil. It's called the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And in Jewish literature, Torah literature, the word knowledge always means intimate mingling, like a marital mingling. The tree of the knowledge of good and evil means the bonding of good and evil, which means if you eat from the fruit of that tree, you can no longer distract and separate the good from the bad. In Kabbalistic writing, that tree is called the Ilana de Sveika, the tree of doubt. It's not the tree of evil. It's the tree of the meshing of good and evil. Once you're contaminated by the fruit of that tree, you can no longer discern with clarity. And look at the result. They speak to God face to face, then they eat the fruit of the tree, and then they find themselves hiding under the trees, hiding from the one who sees through the trees. Talk about confused. And worse than that, when God appears in the garden and he knows that they're hiding under the trees, he says to them, Ayaka, where are you? You play the game as if I can't see you. I play the game your way. I'm your shadow at your right hand. Where are you? I can't see. And as they schlep themselves out in shame and humiliation from under the trees, God says to them, Hamin ha'etz, did you eat? I don't know. God's not knowing is where Haman is born. In other words, when you eat the fruit of that tree, you invoke and absorb into yourself the faculty of confusion. Doubt comes into the world, and that's where Haman is born. And therefore, the battle between us and them, and from then on, the battle becomes a battle of separating the good and the bad, right? That is the battle. And so you think about it, Jewish history is a descent deeper and deeper into confusion and doubt. Originally, the tree began that problem, but at least there was prophecy and miracles in the world. And as history progresses, you eventually get to the point where that clarity closes. And 2,350 years ago, when Purim came on the scene, that was the last vestige of a revealed miracle in the world. Purim is a miracle, but it's hidden. God's name not mentioned in the Megillah. One political event after another. And only when you string it all together do you see the divine hand. And 150 years later, there's Hanukkah with nothing at all, nothing written at all. Except one last miracle, which is a wave goodbye from the world of miracles of the Hanukkah oil. And since then, we've seen no revealed miracles. And that is the wearing of the mask of Purim. The symbolism of the mask is we move into a hidden world where you cannot see what is true and what is not. What presents itself at face value is inaccurate. You have to learn to strip that away. And Rabbi Lawrence, what is Talmudic learning, if not an engaging in doubtful and wrong constructs, only to peel them away and find the truth behind them? The Talmud doesn't present itself like a mathematical textbook. It presents a very convincing argument and then shows you wrong, fooled you. Now let's get a more sophisticated grasp on the truth. So it's a learning to peel away layers of confusion, and that's the drinking. The drinking is a confusion and rising above it. Even when you're drunk and confused, you can still have a deep sense of what is right. The whole message of Purim is what appears to be one reality, the luck of the draw, and the hopelessness of Jewish history, and Esther, the hidden woman. The Jewish agenda at Purim is to penetrate all of that, despite the fact that it may seem hopeless. Go back to that tree of the knowledge of good and evil and learn to discern good from bad in a very confusing world.
So thank you very much for that. We'll be looking at drink in a moment, and we'll be looking at a couple of the other points that you raised in just a moment. I'd like to give Rebecca the opportunity to come back on it, and possibly also, just as you do so, Rebecca, Rabbi Tatz talked about, Hamin ha'et, asking the question where God clearly knows the answer, but using questioning as a way of drawing out the inner truth. And perhaps you could talk a little bit about how that fits into the work you do and helping people find their true self.
Well, I often think therapy is about the questions you ask, right? It's it's about creating stories, about bringing forth narratives that people have about themselves or the world around them. But I was curious about this idea of knowing and not knowing, and about certainty and uncertainty. And I think in the pandemic, more than ever, people have suddenly been confronted with this idea that the world isn't certain around us. Oh, newsflash, it's not. But people felt they were so in control of their lives that this came as an enormous surprise. Most of the clients I see are terrified that the world around them is outside of their remit of control. So I would suggest an idea that again from the family therapy world, which is called safe uncertainty, which is sort of this ideal position. I would suggest it maybe connects with some of what Rabbi Tatz was saying, which is the idea that the world can feel confusing and uncertain, but through faith, through connection, through our values, as Alastair mentioned before, we can feel safe within the uncertainty of the times that we're in.
Thanks. And Alastair?
Yeah, I mean, just listening to those two very interesting points. The thing that occurs to me about those is, what do you do with doubt and uncertainty? I think you can let it crush you. You can say that nothing is certain, that any decision you make could be wrong, it's not clear, and you can really regress into a fog of anxiety. I think the contrast is, I think, the Haman way, which is, he's clearly got a tinge of narcissism in the way that he deals with his own uncertainties. And one senses that he is compensating or overcompensating for his very fragile ego, his intolerance of criticism, his weak sense of self. And that crippling doubt comes across in this overbearing narcissism that I think characterizes his behavior. I mean, seriously, however important you are, you don't actually need people to bow down to you as you walk by. You can just know that you have the power, and that should be enough, unless you have that narcissism about you. So I think how you manage that doubt, as I think both Rabbi Tatz and Rebecca were saying, is key.
Thanks. So let's get to the eating and drinking aspect of it. Rabbi Tatz introduced the idea of drinking as putting yourself into that environment where things are a little less certain. We make a lot about eating and drinking in Judaism. We get together as family meals. It's an opportunity to bond. Pesach is about creating community and shared memory around the table. It's very important to us. But Purim is unique in the focus on excess, and particularly the focus on drink ad lo yada, to the point where you lose knowledge and control at a certain level. Is in today's age, and we see the notes going out from Shomrim and other people, don't get drunk, don't drive drunk, be responsible, be aware. Have we created a monster of an idea of celebrating intoxication and celebrating abandon, which is actually irresponsible, and we need to rein back or rethink or re-explain? A big question, and I'm going to throw it first to Rabbi Tatz.
I think there's no question that this has been misinterpreted and misapplied and misused largely today. Like all Jewish customs, the drinking on Purim is tremendously deep and sophisticated. The concept is ad lo yodo, means to rise beyond the dot. That means even when you reach a stage where things are no longer clear, there's a deep inner sense of what's correct. And there's an indissoluble bond to that. Just to try to put this into words in a clumsy way, there's an innate sense of right and wrong and your own identity, which really should transcend logic. Perhaps one way to see it is somebody very deeply immersed in a profession, for example, can often have a feeling for what's right, even when they themselves cannot necessarily tell you why that is. You know, I think in the world of medicine, for example, you have people who are so accomplished with so many decades of rich experience that sometimes there's a deep sense of what the correct course of action is, even before a logical process. In Torah, we call that Da'as Torah. Da'as Torah means a person so imbued and so richly trained by a life of striving for objectivity that when you ask halachic decision or a life guidance decision, the person will often know what the correct course of action is, even when the calculation is not available, or even when the calculation comes out exactly 50-50. You know, many people think that the right thing to go and ask your rabbi is the kind of questions that really you should have been able to look up in a book yourself. That's not really the purpose of a learned person. The purpose of a learned rabbinic opinion is when you've looked it up yourself already and it's not clear. Somebody of superior wisdom in Torah is a person who, even when the calculation's been done and the result is not clear, they still have a deep sense of what it is that should be done. This is something that's transcendent. It's beyond logic. It's a deep aspect of our spiritual being. And wine is one of the ways to access that. As I'm sure everyone's aware, the Talmud says when wine enters, the secret world is revealed. Obviously, at a simplistic level, it means, you know, you spill your secrets. But the word yayin in Hebrew adds up to 70, just as the word sod, which means the secret world. And therefore, the subtle understanding of wine, apart from all its mystical connotations, is that it releases an inner wisdom and brings out a depth. Used correctly, of course, there's a heavy price to be paid. It's very dangerous. And I would say very clearly, if you're not living at the spiritual level where wine will do that to you, leave it out, right? Leave it out. Don't try it at home if all it's going to do is make you silly and, descend into being part of the scenery. That's not the intention. The intention is to drink if you're the kind of person who's so spiritually pure that even when you drink and the logic disappears, you'll still be a refined and very high human being. Let me add one word, if I may. The Gaon of Vilna points out something remarkable. He says that in Judaism, we take wine at all opportunities to connect the material and the spiritual. For example, a circumcision, right? We're taking that aspect of humanity, which is potentially the most sordid, and giving it the ability to transcend as a cup of wine. Marriage also involves a potentially sordid and fallen aspect of human function, and we call it Kiddushin, sanctity. We have a cup of wine. When Shabbat, the mundane of the week, transcends into the higher mode of Shabbos, we take a cup of wine. Wine is always our connector, where you use a physical substance to release a potential for something higher when used carefully. And he points out something remarkable. Physical things all get worse with time. Spiritual things get better, like judgment and wisdom and maturity. All physical systems degrade with time, whether it's mechanical systems or the body. Only one exception. Wine is a physical substance and it gets better with time. It shares a quality with the spiritual world. And so we use it to access the spiritual world. And that's emblematic of Judaism. We're using the material to access the spiritual. And so that should be the consciousness of using wine judiciously and carefully and in the right proportion. If it's going to be anything lower than that, it should be avoided.
So the Vilna Gaon clearly only experienced wine that was kept in well-corked, correctly corked bottles, properly preserved, and hadn't had the opportunity to turn into vinegar. Quite possibly some of our wider congregants have had a different experience of wine and have seen that a little too much of it and too much of it around has very negative connotations. Al, how do you feel about drinking being elevated on a chag and the dangers that might bring out, and how we manage joy?
I mean, Rabbi Tatz reminded me, so I'm sort of bringing this back down to a level probably you wanted to elevate it from, but there was a quote from Matt Groening, the creator of The Simpsons, when he says, "Here's to alcohol, the cause of and the solution to all of life's problems." And, I think there was something in that. I think, that there's various sort of aspects to the question. There's alcohol in terms of acute intoxication and behaving badly. And then there's alcohol as a danger to alcoholism and unhealthy drinking. I think if you take the latter and you look at all the reasons why people develop unhealthy drinking patterns, there's a range of them. There's genetic factors. In fact, Jews about 20% of us lack a particular enzyme that metabolizes one of the alcohol products, gives you worse hangovers, and it's actually protective from alcoholism because you feel too lousy if you drink too much. But there's a psychological aspect, which is drinking to sort of cope with negative feelings and low mood and all of that. But there's a third sort of socialized aspect of drinking. And I think it's something that people have looked at in research settings to say, if you drink in a more responsible socialized way, if you have your first alcoholic drink at the Friday night table, the Shabbos table, and you drink in moderation, you understand, if you like, the correct and appropriate use of alcohol, rather than drink in a pub at 14 because all your friends are, then it will lead to a very different outcome. So I think there is something about this socialized use of alcohol that's probably relatively healthy, and more broadly the sense of community that that festivals like Purim sort of bring about, I think is mentally very protective. Feeling part of something greater than you, feeling part of a community is a good thing by and large. But clearly, as Matt Groening says, it's a double-edged sword.
Rebecca, parent of teenage children.
Well, I was going to pull that card as well, so you preempted it. But I was going to say, as a mother of teenagers, and there might be lots of other mothers of teenagers listening here, or grandparents of teenagers, that, there's a real fear that, they'll go out on Purim and it's a great excuse to drink alcohol and get drunk and potentially do risky things, which teenage boys are more likely to do. But I also agree with Alastair that, this can be done in safe spaces, in community spaces, where there are other people sort of keeping an eye and checking in that, nothing untoward is happening. And also being mindful that for the last 2 years, our teenagers have effectively been locked up and haven't socialized into the usual norms of what is teenage behavior. And so they've sort of come out of this lockdown period of 2 years and are finding their way and are testing things out and are naturally taking risks and experimenting, which is also part of a healthy, normal development. So just that, adding that perspective, really.
Right. Do you think that shuls should be places where bottles are passed around and?
Absolutely not, but I do know, and they shall remain nameless, of other spaces in our Northwest London Jewish community where that might well happen.
Well, Lawrence, I'd like to add something if I may.
Thanks.
Particularly on the North American scene, this has been pointed out, and I think we do see it around us, that I think a disturbing trend has been to drink to excess Shabbos and Shabbos Kiddushes. I don't recall that phenomenon when I was much younger in the Orthodox Jewish world. And I think alarm bells are starting to ring. Traditionally, alcoholism has not been a problem in the Jewish community. Even though we live in a world where alcohol is a massive problem, it's noteworthy that in virtually every Western society, you need to be 18 or more, maybe even 21 to buy a drink. And we put wine in a kid's mouth when he's 8 days old. We have no problem with that. I mean, we have no problem with that at all. But over the last couple of decades, this has been a disturbing trend. Rabbi Twersky, who was an addiction specialist, obviously, he made the point, and he came in for a lot of censure when he published his book on addictions and alcoholism. People said, "Why are you washing this dirty linen, in public?" And I asked him the question once, and he answered that that we can't hide this anymore. There are now incidences of alcoholism coming through and families being destroyed by it and youth getting the idea. And I think that's a disturbing trend, and I think it needs to be noted.
Thank you very much. So Megillah begins with a banquet where a king directs his queen to come and dance. And she takes the stance, I don't want to do it. I don't want to do it the way you want me to do it. Plenty of good commentaries about what's going on. And Malbim saying this is Achashverosh, who has risen through the ranks to where he is. trying to squash his wife, who comes from royal nobility. And it's a way of showing that, you know, he is in charge, even though her claim to the throne gives his claim greater strength because she's part of the old regime. He needs to be able to show, I am now the boss, and so you will come to me, you'll wear the crown when I say, you'll dress as I want. And then we have beauty contests and pampering women, and you know, it's true that Esther eventually becomes the heroine and takes the difficult decision and seizes the moment and becomes the person who is the queen, and we have a lot to thank her for. But the portrayal of women and the role of the patriarchy in the Megillah, you know, how are we supposed to see good role models for men and women in the story? Rabbi Tatz.
Well, personally, I think the Megillah is enough to drive a feminist up the wall. You know, you have this Persian king, and you know, apart from the treatment of his wife Vashti, which ends in a summary execution, you know, think about how he chooses a new queen. He sends his agents out into the kingdom to find these most amazingly stunning virgins, you know, innumerable. And then they pickle them for 6 months in perfumes and oils. I mean, if you're a feminist, this is going to, you know, this is beyond acceptable. And then they don't find favor in his eyes. He would never see them again. And of course, they couldn't marry anyone else, because anyone who'd been with a king, of course, unavailable to marry anyone else. You're talking about a level of megalomaniac, you know, a male dominance over a harem, which is beyond understanding. So I think that there's a very, very clear denigration of that type of anti-feminist, you know, statement. It's hard to equal that. Maybe the ancient world, that was undoubtedly a norm, but there's a very strong. Then you look at the relationship between Mordechai and Esther, in which he has total implicit trust that she's capable of saving the Jewish people. You know, there's a teamwork going on between them of total confidence. She totally trusts his Torah guidance, even though she's not afraid to question it. And he totally trusts her ability to pull off the action at the coalface. I mean, it's quite remarkable. So yes, I think you see in the Megillah a very deep insight into the extreme objectification of women. Let's add one more detail, if I may, and that is there's a fascinating debate in the Talmud about whether Esther was beautiful or not. One opinion is she was one of the foremost beautiful women ever. Other opinion is that she had a green face. You know, she was strange looking. In fact, the Medrash Rabbi says, believe it or not, she was 75 years old at the time of the Purim story. That is really peculiar. Here's this Persian king bringing in these most amazingly beautiful young girls, and among them, they bring in a 75-year-old married lady with a green face. I mean, what were they thinking? So that leads into a fascinating question about what feminine beauty actually is. And this perhaps a bit long to discuss now in detail, but here the Gemara, commenting on the Talmud, is actually giving a very deep insight into what feminine beauty is. And in a very, very small nutshell, the Torah presents a very deep conflict on this issue. On the one hand, the Torah talks about women's beauty in very, very explicit terms, how beautiful Sarah was and Rivka and all our matriarchs and Abigail. I mean, we talk in extreme terms about their beauty. No question that we praise it with in very extreme terms. And the problem with that is, why is it important? You're talking about a document of spiritual teaching. Why is external physical beauty important? But more problematic is that the same Torah denigrates female beauty. Sheker Achen and Hevel HaYofi, that beauty is vanity and emptiness. And, you know, what a dichotomy we have in Torah sources about feminine physical beauty. Incidentally, as an aside, says Sheker Achen and Hevel HaYofi. That means charm is a lie and beauty is, vanity. In the religious world, when you speak to a young man and you propose a young lady that he should meet, you know, you tell him all about the young lady. And then, of course, an unspoken question is whether she's good looking or not. Well, it's not religious to say she's good looking. So you tell him she has a lot of sheker and hevel, you know. She's got lots of vanity and, that's a coded way of saying she's also good looking. But the point is The point is that the Torah on the one hand praises feminine beauty, and at the same time tells you that it's lies and vanity, and the Talmud has a discussion about Rabbi Yeshua ben Hanania, a very ugly rabbinic personality who was very wise. And a Roman woman questions him, how can such beautiful wisdom be contained in such an ugly vessel? Fascinating discussion, and the Talmud there makes it plain that you can only have pure content when the vessel is broken. When the exterior makes much of itself, it damages the content. This is a very interesting tension in Torah sources. And very briefly, the resolution is, the one resolution that's wrong, by the way, when I talk about this in the Beis Yaakov, the young teenage girls in the religious world, they look at me with pity. They say, Rabbi, you don't understand. The Torah is not talking about physical beauty. It's talking about spiritual beauty. That's definitely wrong. The reason we know it's wrong is because the Egyptians were ready to kill for Sarah. And the Egyptians were not looking for, rabbits and material. The Egyptians were as depraved as you can imagine. There's no question she must have been stunning in a conventional sense. And the answer is that in the original human condition, the body was incredibly beautiful. And that's why Adam and Eve were naked. Because the body shone with the light of the soul. Such a body doesn't need clothing. But as history progresses, the body thickens up and becomes more and more of an obstruction. The material obstructs more and more the spiritual. And by the time we get to Purim, when prophecy is about to end and the inner light of the world is about to fade, we reach a stage in history where Esther already enters that zone. On the one hand, she harks back to the beauty of the early generations, but on the other hand, she all ushers in an age where the heaviness of the body and the material is so thick that now we need very cautious and modest presentation of the material, lest it take over entirely. So that's another theme that the Megillah is bringing out here in terms of was she beautiful, was she not beautiful, and the correct place of feminine beauty and aesthetic beauty in general.
Thank you very much. Rebecca, objectification. Esther, is not presented in schools as being 75 years old and ugly or green in the face. To be a little queen gives you the opportunity to succeed. Do we have a problem with the objectification of women and the way that's presented through Purim and today?
Yeah, I think, we don't learn in school that essentially Esther was going into a harem, a brothel, there was rife sexual abuse, and it's very distasteful, it's very uncomfortable as a woman to think about it. But I'm also not sure that, dare I disagree with Rabbi Tatz, that it's necessarily anti-feminist. I think that the beginning of the Megillah, from what I recall, Esther is described in the third person. The story is about her. And then as the Megillah moves and the story is told, she begins to find her voice. She's savvy, she's strategic, she allows herself to be vulnerable. She uses her femininity to help save her people because of her beauty, because of her femininity. That's how she's able to go to Achashverosh and ask for her help. It says he was smitten by her. So she uses it to her advantage. So I think we can be very quick to, say women are objectified and how terrible that is. But we also have to acknowledge within ourselves, I think, as women, that we use our femininity. And we can, be proud of it.
Alastair.
I would add too much to what's already been said, apart from one observation, which is that the structures back then were all very patriarchal. The way the competition was set up to find a new wife, the way women were treated, the whole structure was very patriarchal. But the women did not behave like sort of mindless pawns in a game. I mean, Vashti defied him and Esther manipulated Ahasuerus. There wasn't it wasn't that they were sort of wet or passive in any way. Yes, it was the structures that did for them. And but I would just say that the way that the women are portrayed is anything but sort of passive, recipients of whatever the men said that they should do.
Let's remember that they issued an edict. The advisors insisted that the king sent out a letter that every man should be the ruler in his home. I mean, it was societally enacted, order. Every man shall rule in his home. It was an international edict.
Probably you'd only need to do that if the facts contradicted it on the ground anyway.
And also that possibly was the alcohol talking, that, he made that decision while he was drunk.
I've no doubt the women ignored it totally.
Right, and you talk about he makes decisions when he's drunk. It is leads into a next chapter opening with regret. So we see that in the story. I'd like to jump to the very end of the Megillah. Leaves us with Mordechai, beloved by the majority of his people. You would think it says Rov Amav, and the majority of his people. You'd like to imagine that he'd done such a fantastic job that he would be loved by absolutely everybody. He'd be the ultimate hero. So there's an explanation that's given for this, that Mordechai himself had brought some of the problems onto the people. He didn't need to stand up to Haman in such an antagonistic manner. That it's clear that he wasn't worshiping him. What he'd done by being a public Jew, standing up to the vizier, was something that was calculated to trigger Haman's narcissistic personality into a hostility against the whole people, and the whole thing exploded. And actually, some of the Gedolim, or the leading Jews of the era, were concerned that for everything that Mordechai had done to correct it, he was responsible for sticking not only his neck out, but everybody else's as well. How do we stand up to bullies? And I think it's a question that is something that must be on the forefront of our minds at the moment as we look at what's happening in Ukraine. We've had a question: do we appease the bully? Do we stand up for what for what is right? How far is the West supposed to go in allowing somebody to have their way, and true destruction of peoples and provinces happening all around us? So there's an awful lot to unpack there. But I was wondering, are there Purim messages that people have on the Ukraine situation, on the mindset of the victims and the mindset of the perpetrators? Perhaps, Alastair, you could start us off on this one.
Yeah, I'm not sure I have any special insights, but it is very striking, isn't it? These age-old dilemmas just keep revisiting us, and each time we are faced with them, we revert back to the very first time it happened, because the problem is that we can only see in retrospect whether it worked out or not. If we knew that by standing up to Putin, for example, we would strike a victory for Western liberal democracy rather than get dragged into a terrible war, then I think we would all say it's obvious what we should do. But it's only ever obvious after the fact. So I think the decision that Mordechai faced was that he was bringing on a whole world of pain, and he was responsible for it. And I mean, he knew it was going to work out because he believed in God, but probably there were a number of dissenters there who weren't quite so sure, and who felt that he was just inviting a problem that he needn't have had, and come on, all you need to do is bow down and we can be rid of this problem and just get on and live our lives and go to shul and do whatever else we do. And I think that it's tempting, isn't it? And it comes back to what we talked about earlier, which is courage, whether you are prepared to defend your values. And one criticism that's been laid at the West is that we've become complacent, that we no longer want to do the hard job of defending our values, which we say matter to us, because it would mean taking a certain amount of pain along the way. And the question is, does that decadence mean that we are not prepared to take the pain? I think Mordechai's courage and his single-mindedness and his belief allowed him to do that. Whether he had a right to take it on other people's behalf, well, That's a question. If he was a leader, then that was his job to do it. And if he was appointed leader, then it's a reasonable position. But had it not worked out well, I think he would have come in for some very severe criticism.
Rabbi Tatz.
I think a couple of points are relevant here. One is that the Jewish response here, as always, should be a question of judgment. On the one hand, you have the very clear need to make what we call a machor. Machor means a statement of principle, and sometimes a Jew has to do that even if there will be no consequences. In other words, even if you'll not achieve a particular outcome, to be silent and acquiesce by your silence is unacceptable. And therefore, as a position of principle, it's an axiom in Judaism that that statement needs to be made. However, pulling against that is the question of judicious planning and foresight, which means that in this case, I think the process needs to be, as perhaps in all cases, need to know your enemy. So the first thing is an analysis of autocrats and dictators and what are the forces that motivate them. I think it's very important. You can't negotiate successfully or plan a course, chart a course, if you don't know your enemy at all, if you think he's amenable to the same reasonable thoughts that you have. And I think it's very important to know that people in that position of unbridled power, with that level of spiritual and emotional immaturity, they get to see the whole world as extensions of themselves. The child, the baby, sees the whole world as an extension of himself. It's all there to serve him. His mother must wake up at night, and feed him and change him. Her comfort is all irrelevant. The whole world is his. And unfortunately, many adults never outgrow that. The people around them are there only to serve them. And when people expand that to a level of power such as these dictators have, no matter how many people must die, is completely irrelevant to them, completely irrelevant. Millions can die, and that's completely irrelevant. The world is simply an extension of their ego. That needs to be understood very, very deeply. The correct spiritual position is that one's ego needs to expand to include care for others as one cares for oneself. Just to state the correct position, our deep teaching is that you can only really love yourself. I'm sure Alastair will have something to say about this, but you can really only love yourself. Loving another means simply that you're mature enough to expand your sense of identity to include that person. Your wife is part of yourself. In fact, as halachic teaching, we say ishto kegufoi. Your wife is not someone related to you, she's you. Beyond that, you should be mature enough to feel your family's reality as your own. It should tug at your gut when your family suffers. If you're more mature than that, you can feel your neighborhood and your community. If you're spiritually more mature, you should feel the suffering of the Jewish people. If you're a bigger personality, you should feel the suffering of the generation. And if you're big enough spiritually, you should feel God's suffering too. So it's a question of expanding ego in a healthy way, and the dictators and autocrats of the world are exactly the opposite. Having said that, what's the course of action one should choose? Jewish history has taught us that far more important is to judge carefully what the outcomes are likely to be. In other words, yes, you need to make an idealistic statement, that's absolutely true. But I think before that comes a very careful analysis. If you're going to make an idealistic statement and drive the dictator wild, so he pushes a nuclear button or who knows what he's going to do, what do you gain? Your statement of ideology has led to untold misery. And therefore, it's been the pattern of rabbinic leaders ever since the time of Purim, I may add, not before that, because before that we were ruled by prophetic clarity with kings, and there was a full frontal attack on evil with no apologetics at all. But after that, when the shoe is on the other foot, and we have a verse that says it explicitly, Eretz nitna biyad rasha, that's a verse in Job, Eretz nitna biyad rasha, the world is in the control of the wicked. In case, Rabbi Lawrence, you hadn't noticed that. The world is in the control of the wicked. It's not. The world is not being controlled by benign, people who are out for your good. It's being run by people who will kill you for less than a vote. And therefore, since the shoe is on that foot, the practice of Jewish leaders has always been to walk carefully between the raindrops and judge the outcomes, knowing your enemy and knowing their immaturities. And I think that's what needs to be done. Now, I don't have enough knowledge of the political situation on the ground to tell you whether it's actually, Ukraine should say they'll never join NATO, whatever it might be. To me, that would seem the sensible thing to do. Why get yourself killed? Just tell them we won't join NATO. Well, is it so important to make a political? Yeah, I'm not going to comment on the particular politics, but I think the way forward is with a cool, level-headed, steady, pair of hands, teamwork, judging what is likely to be a course of action that is most practically likely to have a good outcome. I think that's the wise way about these things, knowing your enemy's vulnerabilities and ego problem.
Thank you, Rebecca. Geopolitics was not one of the things that you had on your website, but the idea that some people will come to you sometimes and say, you know, it's all about the principle, it's the principle, and then they'll go into some totally self-destructive action because you know, fighting for the principle is more important than the consequences of taking that on. How do you feel?
Well, I think it's also, you know, the different relationships that exist in terms of what's going on here. So there's also, you know, the perpetrators, if you want to say, the victims, and the bystanders. You know, it's more triangular. So we can look at this big macro, you know, what's going on in the Ukraine and Putin and the people that can stand up to it. There was a famous Polish psychologist, I think it was Andrzej Wojciechowski, I think, if I have that right, and he coins the term pathocracy, like a government that's run by, you know, a ruthless, narcissist, pathological person who then creates this team of people who have similar personality traits. And he wrote about it it was Soviet Poland. He was really describing the USSR, and he was imprisoned and he was tortured and he wasn't able to publish any of his works, and eventually he defected to America, and, you know, he published his works. And we can see it more recently with Trump in America, like I think Mary Trump, I have that right, his niece, who's a psychologist, and she was one of the people that, you know, called him out and talked about him being a narcissist. So we might define these as acts of protest, quite grand acts of protest, but on a micro level we see this all the time in our daily lives. How do we stand up to bullies, you ask, but what are our small acts of protest that we might try to step into or achieve or take action on when we face an injustice, or where we face, you know, a manager who's, I don't know, not very kind or bullying us at work? Or how do we teach our children, you know, to stand up to injustice in the playground or something that, you know, has affronted them? So I think holding on to the idea that we can always achieve a small act of protest. I was actually having a conversation this morning with a Russian woman, a client, and we were talking about this very thing because her family are in Russia. She lives here. She's terrified for her family who live in Russia because Russian people are going through a difficult time as well. She feels very uncomfortable with the whole political situation. She doesn't know if she was there, would she stand out on the street? Would she protest, knowing that she would go to prison or something could happen to her family? But what she can do, and what she is choosing to do, is to go on some social media and share videos that have been banned in Russia, so that some of her Russian friends are able to see other perspectives. And that's her small act of protest, and that makes her feel that she's doing some small thing. It helps us to feel less powerless in the face of, you know, people that assume great power.
I like the idea of a small thing. I think one of my favorite teachings in Pirkei Avot is that there isn't a person that doesn't have their moment, and I like to believe that each one of us is created with a moment in mind. We've no idea whether it's some big moment or some small moment, but for HaKadosh Baruch Hu, each of us has a point in our lives for which we were brought to life, and that moment will exist. If we have long lives or short lives, we have to have that moment because each of us exists for that moment. And it's important for us to do what we can to actualize whatever our moment might be. And it might be something that is world shattering, but it might be something small within a family, but that in turn, through the butterfly effect of consequences, could have repercussions, ripples that change things much further down the line. I mean, the remark that you've said that has changed somebody's life, that has then made them into someone who has great consequence. Who knows what the little moment might be? But I like to think that each of us has a moment, and each of us should take that moment to protest or do the little thing, rather than feel I am so insignificant that nothing I do or say can have moment or consequence. It just, you know, you touched on people and their feelings about what's going on in Ukraine. And I've been talking to people who've got family there at the moment, and somebody felt very much they didn't want to get involved in Purim. They've got family suffering, and there's difficult things happening out there, and to be dressing up and partying and getting the schools and all the kids to parties, just not the way they feel at the moment. And we get that, in its own way in halacha. It says there are times of the year when we don't say a hesped. There's no eulogy, there's no mourning, everybody's happy because there's no tachanun. But there are times when we say there's national celebration going on, and therefore you shouldn't feel individually miserable, or you shouldn't be miserable. The community isn't allowed to be miserable. And rabbis get around and say, I'm not allowed to say a eulogy, but this isn't a eulogy, it's always important to say something nice, something alive, and we do that. But people have their own lives that don't always fit into the global or the Jewish calendar and the way it should be going. I thought maybe Rabbi Tatz, do you have a view on how we deal with this distinction between the personal and the communal?
Because I think we touched on it when we spoke about mixed emotions, and I think when there's a halachic obligation, one needs to fulfill it. For example, what could be a more extreme example than stopping mourning on Shabbos? A person has lost someone. They were within 7 days of someone having died in their family. You may not display that, publicly on Shabbat. Now, if the Torah gives you that instruction, obviously it feels you capable of doing that, which means that inwardly, absolutely, with inwardly, there's a certain feeling that is allowed and justified, but not displaying it outwardly. So yes, Judaism does make demands on your emotional state, indeed. I think we are called to evince a certain amount of self-control, and certainly legitimate and even obligatory to have mixed emotions without any question. And therefore, now going beyond, celebrating beyond what's normal or what's needed in a time of sadness, that not. In addition, we have certain halachic constraints. For example, based on a verse, Az Yemale Schoik Pinu, then our mouth shall be full of laughter in the Messianic era. The Talmud learns that it's inappropriate to have a mouth full of laughter in this phase of history. So we break a glass at a wedding. We have a little ash on the head of the chassan. We have an unpaved little piece of our homes to remind us. Absolutely, but the rest of your home should be nice. That piece not. The rest of the wedding celebration should be truly joyous, but you break a glass as well. So there's a sense of proportion, a sense of somewhat limited joy. But as I'm sure many of our listeners know, what Hasidic teaching brought to Judaism is that it should be always an undercurrent of happiness. We say that in Adar you increase happiness, and in Av you minimize happiness. It doesn't say you increase sadness. It says you minimize the happiness. So it's a question of an undercurrent of the faith that is able to generate a quiet confidence and happiness that things will turn out well. And Purim doesn't teach that. What does? That what looks like a destruction is actually building a redemption. Exactly like a woman in labor who has to know that these pains are bringing a life to the world. Doesn't mean you enjoy them, but we're talking about the last laugh, and it's only a deep faith that can celebrate that in the times of sadness. That's appropriate. So one gives vent to the sadness, not too much, and even in difficult times, one has an undercurrent of positivity and optimism. That's very important. And the question is only a question of balance, what's appropriate at any particular time.
Thank you. Alastair, the dissonance between public expectation and personal feeling.
I think we sort of wrestle with that quite a lot in our professional lives, don't we? I mean, all of us have a sort of personal feeling on any given day and a professional persona, which is relatively unvarying. I feel very conflicted giving advice to someone on Purim who is directly connected with the Ukraine conflict. I would say, just thinking from a very personal view rather than anything more deeply sort of psychiatric or religious or anything, that there are two moments that I think about relatively often. One of them is Purim, this sort of everything is hidden, but something will be revealed, which will be to our benefit. And the other was when Joseph reveals himself to his brothers. And there was a comment somewhere that it'll be like when the Mashiach comes and suddenly everything will become clear. why things happened the way they did, why they had to be the way that they did. And I think my first thought was about Purim, that there is a message there, that somehow and in some way things will work out. I don't know whether that's too trite, but it is what I think about.
Thank you very much. Rebecca?
I was thinking about, what is this woman who's coming to you? What's behind her feeling that she can't celebrate Purim? Is it the guilt that she's here and they're there, and so she's not worthy of experiencing joy when her family are experiencing potential destruction? And I meet a lot of people who hold those feelings in mind, who feel that sense of guilt at surviving something and somebody else didn't. And that's closely aligned with, trauma as well. But it's also coming back to what we discussed earlier, which, family therapy call the both and, holding two very different emotions together, experiencing both joy and pain, joy and sadness, and sharing my own, drawing on a very personal story. In 2020, when I got up from Shiva, which wasn't really a Shiva because it was COVID, and went straight into Pesach, and reading the Haggadah and reading Me'eva L'Yom Tov. It was the first time in my life that I've really, really understood those words, and finding that, around our table, we found laughter, we found some joy in our Seder table. And earlier that day, I had a phone call from somebody, 'cause obviously no one could come. And this woman said, "This is going to be the worst Seder you've ever had." And I felt really upset by that. I thought, well, that's very knowing of you to say that, But it wasn't the case at all. And I think when I read those words, Me'eva L'Yom Tov, I thought, you can access joy even in the depths of grief. It's possible. And I think that's hopeful, for not that I would share that story with my clients, but that it is humanly possible to access joy in the face of despair.
I was going to ask everybody to end with a happy thought. Rebecca, you have just brought us a fantastic happy thought to go into Yom Tov. Rabbi Tatz, a happy thought.
Yes, I think it's not only joy in the face of sadness, but it's understanding that in the end, it's the sadness that will bring joy. The Rambam gives the example of the Nafach, Purim being the inversion of tragedy to happiness. And actually, that is the deep theme of laughter. And the verse says that God sits in heaven and laughs. And you might ask, what is a laughing matter about Jewish history? But the fact is, as you look about it, when Haman is building that gallows and checking it with his neck to make sure it fits, and the angel Gabriel comes down and says, "Suits you," So that is spiritually funny. Or the fact that Pharaoh is sitting on his throne and is issuing a decree to have all the children killed because he wants to be sure that he'll destroy the usurper of his throne. In fact, the Medrash says he even had an instruction issued to kill Egyptian boys because the advisors couldn't tell him if it would be a Jewish or an Egyptian child. Here's this potentate sitting on his throne, and he's having all the children killed to make sure that he'll be successful. And on his knee, he's raising the child. That is very, very funny. And it's no accident that the Jewish people are named for the first Jewish child ever born, Yitzchak, which means he shall laugh. And he shall laugh because he's born when it's impossible for his parents. His father's instructed to kill him. It's a black comedy, Torah is. But Yitzchak means the last laugh. And the irony is because he goes through that sacrifice in the altar, he becomes indestructible. And since then, for the last 4,000 years, they've been trying to kill us. And amazingly, we're the only ones who are still here. And therefore, when a woman's in labor and going through those pains, and ironically and amazingly, each pain brings a life to the world. Or as the Rambam says, the child in the womb is disposed in a situation that makes life outside impossible. He's got holes in his heart, blood flowing in the wrong direction, blood vessels going in the wrong place. There's no way this child can survive. And speaking as someone who's delivered dozens of babies, that's exactly what you see when this little child is born. You hold him in your hands, there's no hope for this child. And suddenly the cord clamps down like a cable of steel, the holes in the heart close, the blood reverses direction, 20 things reverse, and suddenly 2.5 minutes later he's doing fine. that's very funny. I mean, it's not funny when you're going through it, I'm sure, and for the mother going through it, but spiritually, that is a source of great humor. And we sing Vatischak Liyom Acharon. We sing to our wives on Friday night, which is a premonition of a messianic birth, that she shall laugh at the day, right, at the last day, and that is, I think, the source of Jewish humor. So you asked me for a happy thought. What strikes me is that Jews are wonderful at humor, even gallows humor, and humor in the worst of times. And the reason is very deeply that history is a joke.
Thank you. Al, a happy thought.
Well, I've been struggling for the last couple of minutes to think of one. When I go running, which I do, you've probably all seen me in my shorts somewhere around Finchley, Hampstead Garden suburb, and it is literally always uphill. And I've often wondered why I can go 2/3 of a run uphill and only 1/3 on the flat and never downhill. Because I think we just have a cognitive bias towards noticing all the headwinds and never the tailwinds. And I think my only happy thought is not really a happy thought, it's a quasi-happy thought that could potentially lead to a happy thought, which is we're very fond of counting our troubles, but we are very rarely as keen to count our joy. So maybe the one happy thought is to start to stack them up as well. And maybe you'll find some tailwinds as well in your life.
Alastair, I have an advice for you. You're running the wrong way around your course. I think you're running the other way.
That could work.
And with that happy thought, it is my great pleasure to thank Rabbi Tatz, Alastair Santhouse, Rebecca Corney, and all of you for joining us for an evening looking at Purim on the Analyst's couch. There's an awful lot of mental health ideas that come out of the Megillah and our celebration. As with every Yom Tov, and it's important that as we eat and as we drink and as we celebrate as a community, we can also reflect on what will give us good mental health and what will give us good humor. So to everybody here, may you be strengthened, supported, and healthy with your families and with your communities over Yom Tov. Thank you very much, all of you, for joining us this evening. Good evening.